Horror is a massive genre consisting of a slew of subgenres, whether it be slasher, supernatural, psychological, home invasion, or even body horror. It is filled to the brim with subcategories to cater to all audiences. So this is the top 5 scariest horror movie subgenres. Let's jump in. Coming in at number 5, we have supernatural horror. Supernatural horror is perhaps one of the more mainstream entries on our list before we get into the more weird and wacky further down the line. Supernatural movies for the most part focus on ghosts and demons, any real kind of supernatural force, often topped off with elements of religion. Now, many horror movies that fall into this category include The Conjuring, Sinister, Hereditary, The Witch, Poltergeist, Rosemary's Baby, Lights Out, It, Carrie, and of course, The Exorcist. There are of course many more, however The Exorcist is one of the perfect examples of a supernatural horror, darker forces being at play, combined with religious elements as we witness a young girl become possessed by a demon. However, it was actually Rosemary's Baby starring Mia Farrow that popularized depictions of demonic activity and witchcraft in horror movies, which sparked a slew of films to follow including The Omen, Poltergeist, and The Exorcist. The latter is of course the highest grossing supernatural horror film. Adjusted for inflation, the movie grossed around $956 million, which is absolutely insane. This is exactly why filmmakers, more often than not, will steer towards supernatural horrors, which tend to be far more profitable and accessible as opposed to the other subgenres we're about to get into. Not to mention, there is something so inherently terrifying about the supernatural. It's the fear of the unknown, the fear of what goes bump in the night, the fear that there are darker forces at play. Coming in at number 4, we have body horror. Body horror is an acquired taste in the horror genre, but it's personally one of my favorites, resulting in some of the greatest horror movies ever made. Body horror intentionally showcases grotesque and disturbing violations of the human body, whether that be through mutations, mutilation, or zombification. There are many different ways to present it. One of the most iconic horror movies that falls into this category is of course David Cronenberg's The Fly, which sees Jeff Goldblum mutate into a fly over the course of the movie, and it is incredibly disturbing. Now, body horror often overlaps with many other subgenres, whether it be splatter, slasher, or even monster. Case in point, The Fly. Over the years though, David Cronenberg has made sure to claim his title as the king of body horror, with other works such as Shivers and Rabbit. Body horror is certainly not for mainstream audiences, with some of the movies falling into this category disturbing me to the point that I can't return and watch it again. But that means the job was done correctly. You're never supposed to feel comfortable, you're actually supposed to feel disturbed and slightly violated, which is why this subgenre is by far one of the most terrifying in the whole of horror. In at number 3, we have slasher. Slasher is an absolute classic subgenre, with some of the greatest horror movies in cinematic history falling into this category. Now, despite the term slasher occasionally being used as a generic term for any movie involving murder, slasher actually involves the villain of the movie murdering a group of people, usually by using a bladed tool. So don't be so quick to call everything a slasher movie when it's not always the case. To quote the wiki definition of slasher, I quote, "Slasher typically adheres to a specific formula. A past wrongful action causes severe trauma that is reinforced by a commemoration or anniversary that reactivates or re-inspires the killer." When I read this, it's easy to immediately think of Friday the 13th, of course. Jason, he drowns in the lake after camp counselors were negligent. Now he returns on the anniversary to seek revenge on those at Camp Crystal Lake. Doesn't matter if you're involved or not, you're gonna die. Spooky stuff. Some of the most notable slashers include the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Black Christmas, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Candyman, Scream, and of course, Halloween, the most iconic slasher film of all. Now, Halloween was considered the golden age of slasher films, which took place between 1978 to 1984, with John Carpenter's Halloween being extremely profitable and developing a cult following. On top of that, many filmmakers to come took Halloween's template of a villain stalking a group of teens and escalated it into future movies. Now, despite us having exited the golden age of slasher cinema, there are still many slashers being made today, and some truly great ones, including It Follows, Happy Death Day, Truth or Dare, and of course the new Halloween movies, and the soon-to-come Candyman remake. The slasher subgenre is one of the most iconic and one of the greatest in the horror genre. In at number 2, we have torture slash splatter. Because, of course, if I'm doing this list, you could have put money on me including torture as one of the numbers. It's arguably one of my favorite subgenres, consisting of some of my favorite movies. Torture or splatter is a horror subgenre that specifically focuses on graphic gore and graphic violence. It particularly aims at our universal love of watching people get hurt in horror movies. We often revel in it, and torture specifically discusses this. It deals with the fears of the unknown and the physical destruction of the human body and the pain that goes along with that. It's typically completely over the top depending on what you're looking at. Although saying that, there is plenty of French new wave horror that keeps me up at night. It's just too damn real. Now, some history for you. It was between the years of 2003 to 2009 that the term torture porn was coined, combining the elements of splatter and slasher. Now, movies that fall into the torture porn category are Hostel, Saw, Wolf Creek, The Devil's Rejects, Touristas, and more. Now, Hostel, directed by Eli Roth, was the first film to be classified as torture porn by critic David Edelstein, with movies such as Saw and Wolf Creek quickly following in its footsteps. It has become an incredibly profitable subgenre, with Saw grossing over $100 million worldwide, and Hostel grossing over $80 million. Though incredibly disturbing and frightening, viewers keep returning because we can't help but marvel at the obscene. It's why we always rear our heads when there's a car crash. That seemed dark. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have psychological horror. Believe it or not, I personally believe psychological horror to not just be one of the best subgenres in horror, but also one of the scariest. Psychological horror has a particular focus on mental, emotional, and psychological states, using our own minds to frighten and unsettle us. Now, whether or not you know what classifies as a psychological horror or not, I'm gonna fill you in right now. Some of the classic psychological horrors that have shaped cinema are movies such as The Silence of the Lambs and The Shining, with more recent entries including Midsommar, Hereditary, and Get Out. The subgenre is filled to the brim with some of the greatest horror movies ever made, with the likes of Midsommar and Hereditary packing unbelievable amounts of dread into their runtime, with you never being quite sure what is going on, what is real, who you can trust, etc. And of course, in the classic horror, The Shining, we quite literally watch someone lose their mind over the course of the movie and embrace dangerous and terrifying tendencies. Psychological horror is perhaps the scariest because we can all relate to losing our mind in some capacity or another, not having complete control over how you are feeling and losing yourself in a black void. The brain is the most powerful, yet it controls us. There's nothing scarier than that, if you ask me. It exposes the darker parts of the human psyche and in turn makes us absolutely terrified of the people in our life because you never know who could just snap at any moment. Misery is a perfect example of that. Annie Wilkes is a charming woman next door who'll save you from a car wreck, but if you don't do as she asks, she'll also break your ankles with a hammer. So watch out. Well, there we have it. Do you guys agree with our list? Were there any horror movie subgenres that we miss? Leave us all your thoughts and feelings in the comments down below and perhaps we can do a part 2. Before I go though, I just want to respond to a few comments from one of our last videos. Top 5 religious horror movies. Nicholas Shieldsman said, Lucy, I freaking love every one of these movies. I own them all. Respect. There were a lot of movies that I could have included and I know a lot of you were angry I missed big ones out, but I'm sure there'll be a part 2. Eddie McGuinness said, oh my god, Lucy, you're right. That scene to this day scares the shit out of me every time I watch it. I had to go back and think about what scene you were talking about because I'd already forgotten and moved on. But I believe it was the exorcism of Emily Rose when she saw like contorted on the floor. Timothy Dull said, loved Constantine. My daughter's name came from the movie. Izzy, can she get a shout out, Lucy? Yes, she can. Hello, Izzy. Sidra Grossom said, a most exceptional list, Lucy, most glorious. Every selection was well placed. Though I would have put Ninth Gate in number 3, Polanski's talent for creating such an ease, even in the most amazing of locations, was in full force. So when will we see your 3 to 5 part horror anthology? Discreetly offers ridiculous bribe. Thought I'd ask 10,000 out of 100. That's amazing. That was a big comment with a lot of information in there. But all I'm gonna say is thank you. Rustin Lander said, word of the day, polarized. It's my favorite word. I'm gonna pepper it in when I can. And on that note, if you haven't already, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up. And until next time, I'll see you later.